Alright, good afternoon ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Sun and I'm one of the organizers of the conference. I'm very excited to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce the speaker of our next talk, Dr. Wheeldon. Dr. Wheeldon is an experimental psycholinguist in the School of Psychology at the University of Birmingham. She received her MA in Psychology and Linguistics from the University of Edinburgh and her PhD in Experimental Psychology from the University of Cambridge. Prior to moving to Birmingham, she was a scientific staff member of the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. The majority of her research focuses on the processes underlying the generation of speaking sentences and the nature and timing of the sentence planning processes. She is also interested in the generation of phonological structure of the speech, as well as acquisition of phonological and prosodic structure in young children and the roles of phonological structure in reading. Her recent research aims to investigate the representation of morphological structure in the adult Mandarin lexicon using FMI techniques. Besides this, she is also a very nice person with a pleasant personality, and we are very grateful for her presence among us today. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wheeldon.
Thank you very much. You make me blush. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. We're now back to three mean anovas, but we are going to talk about phonology, so that's probably evening it up a bit. So the language process I want to talk about today is phonological encoding, and that's the process by which we generate the sound structure of the utterances we produce. I'm actually struggling with that because I've been talking all day. This work has been done over now quite a frightening number of years, and my main collaborator on it has been Oditi Lahiri, who is a theoretical phonologist and is currently the chair of linguistics at Oxford University. And this is very much a linguistics phonology talk. So, what I'm going to be focusing on is the role of prosodic units in the planning of spoken utterances. And prosody in general terms refers to the rhythmic structure of the speech that we produce. But I'm going to be focusing on one particular prosodic unit, which is the phonological word, and I'll tell you what I think that means in a bit. I'm going to be talking about behavioural experiments. The bulk of the research that I do is good old-fashioned Dust Bowl reaction time methodologies. And this series of experiments was designed to investigate two things: whether phonological word structure has consequences for utterance planning processes, and how English phrases are parsed into phonological words. Now, actually the English stuff will be a very small part at the end. The reason I decided to talk about this stream of research is that it was something that for which we had really clear theoretical questions and predictions, both from linguistic theory and from psycholinguistic theory, but for which we had no methodology, and it was very difficult to work out how we could test these predictions. So what I'm going to be telling you about is a fairly simple methodology that we developed that was based on some really classic research of Sternberg and his colleagues in the 1970s and 80s, where they did a really elegant series of experiments investigating the process of producing spoken lists of words and digits that have been very fully prepared. They were interested in motor planning, but that's not what we took from it. The English experiments, which is probably going to be the 5 minutes at the end, was an extension of the original experiments which we ran in Dutch. And I'll be spending some time talking about those just to give you the background. And both the English and the Dutch experiments were designed to test the predictions not only of linguistic theory but of an influential model of phonological encoding, which gives the phonological word an explicit role, and this is the model of laid out that was developed at the Max Planck in Nijmegen. Okay, so when we're producing utterance, we have an idea we want to express, we need to build a syntactic structure, we need to retrieve words. But we also then need to generate a sound structure that we can articulate. And the question we're really going to be focusing on is how is an ordered string of words in this syntactic lexical representation then transformed into a continuous utterance. Now, what any linguist would argue very strongly is you simply can't retrieve and concatenate stored representations of lexical form. And the reason you can't do this is that in connected speech, words can be restructured so that their sound structure differs and also that their lexical and syllable boundaries don't coincide. So in connected speech, you can get quite different word forms, or forms for what you want to utter, that really can have a lot of differences with the canonical sound form of the word that you might have retrieved from your lexicon. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you some examples. There are many examples of phonological processes that change speech in fluent production. Let's take this word, for example. So in most accents of British English, however, unfortunately not my own, this word is produced without its word final R. So I will do my best received pronunciation. It's finger. Okay, so we don't, in most accents in British English, pronounce word final R's. However, that R can emerge when the word is followed by a vowel. And that can occur both within word, if you suffix the word, so stop fingering my jewellery, it's fingering. And also, in English, across word boundaries, so my finger is bruised. So my finger is bruised. Not only does this R emerge, but it resyllabifies to form the onset of the following syllable. So you say finger is, not finger is. Yeah? But this isn't just some kind of low-level articulatory accommodation, because it doesn't happen in all contexts. And importantly, it doesn't happen if you've got a prosodic break in between the end of that word and the following vowel. So if you say you'll break your finger if you're not careful, you won't get the R emerging and it won't be syllabified. Another reason that these effects can't really be explained in terms of some low-level articulatory device is that they differ across languages. So if you think of German, German also doesn't like the pronunciation of word final R's. So the word beer, which in Scottish properly has its word final R, in both English and German would be beer. Yes? Beer. But if you add a suffix, so if you pluralize it, die Biere sind kalt, the R emerges and resyllabifies. But in German, this does not happen across word boundaries. So you would say, das Bier ist kalt. Das Bier ist kalt. Yeah, you don't get an emerging R in German. But you absolutely get it in English. So the beer is cold. The beer is cold. So, according to linguistic theory, what we do with the surface structure, with our syntactic information, our lexical content, is that we then build a prosodic structure. And it's that prosodic structure that determines the content, the phonological content of our utterance. And in particular, resyllabification in English occurs within phonological words, and these are prosodic units with one main stress, and they can be larger than lexical words. So examples of phonological words are finger is, ear is, and you can have really much longer strings in quite fast connected speech. So I gave it him, where the syllable structure will change in that string. Okay, so as I said, there is one psycholinguistic theory of phonological encoding that gives phonological words a central role. Excuse me. So as I've said, the main input to phonological encoding is a surface syntactic structure with associated lexical concepts. Not all of it, but at least the front end. So according to this model, how do we then phonologically encode an utterance like given it? So your lexical concepts will allow you to retrieve lexical word form information from your word form lexicon. And the retrieval of this information provides you with two pieces of information. You get the segments and you get the metrical structure. So you have the segments that give in and it. They're all monosyllabic. If there are more syllables, you get the relative stress pattern as well. Then based on phrasal information from the incoming representation and this information from the word form lexicon, what the processor does is it builds rhythmic units, it builds phonological words, and it's to these phonological word frames that segments get associated. And this process occurs from left to right according to the syllabification rules of your language. Once you've built your phonological word, you know what syllables you need, you can go and pick up syllable motor programs which you can then articulate. So this is Levaut's model of phonological encoding. And as I said, the phonological word has a central role. So it is the unit of phonological encoding. It is the unit to which segments are associated in connected speech. Critically, phonological encoding is an incremental process, so segments are made available separately and associated to phonological words from left to right. Minimal look ahead, so it's an incremental process. And the phonological word is also, according to this model, the minimum unit of output. So if you're producing connected speech, you kind of want to build a whole phonological word before you start articulation. So these are the claims that Levaut made. So we wanted to test these claims, and we looked long and hard, because if prosodic units, like phonological words, are generated during speech planning processes, it has to be possible to demonstrate effects of their computation on speech production latencies. If you need to do this before you can start to speak, we should be able to show that somehow in how long it takes you to start to speak. When we were looking, there wasn't a lot in the literature to give us an idea about how we could go about testing this idea. But eventually we found, as I said, this series of experiments, Sternberg et al., who investigated the production of prepared lists of digits or words. So basically they gave subjects lists of words or digits in varying lengths. There was a small group of highly trained subjects, and they were supposed to prepare to say them, so, get really ready. You've got this list. As soon as you hear a signal, you've got to start producing that list as quickly as you can. And what they measured was the relationship between the number of words in the list and the onset latency to the list, so how long it took you to start to articulate the list. And what they found was a very clear linear relationship, such that your mean production latency went up, dependent on the number of words in the list. They also showed this really couldn't be explained in terms of a memory effect. Just, oh God, I've got more things in my head to remember, I'm trying to get them organised, it'll take me a bit longer to start, because you got exactly the same slope of function for extremely well-learned lists like days of the week or numbers. So you get exactly the same effect if you said, prepare to say 1, 2, 3, 4, which really can't be exhausting your memory capacity at all. And they basically, at this point, said there's evidence that when we produce a prepared utterance, the time taken to start to speak is a function of the number of output units that you're storing, that you've built and that you're storing ready to go on the signal. So this was interesting, but their further experiments were much more interesting, because they did a number of experiments to try to determine what an output unit was. I mean, what is this output unit that you've created and you're holding in your head? It clearly wasn't words, because you get the same pattern with non-words. It was also clearly not syllables, because when they got people to prepare to say matched lists of disyllabic words, the slope of the function stayed the same, and if it was syllables, of course, it would go up, you're doubling. And it was also not lexical items, because when you got people to and produce the same monosyllables, but now with de-stressed function words in between. Again, the slope didn't differ. So you got exactly the same slope of function, whether you were saying bear a mark, bear a market, bear a mark. Okay? So what they claimed was that this output unit that people had constructed and were holding on to before they had to produce the list was a stress group. So a unit of speech with one main stress, and to us that looked awfully like a phonological word. Of course you can't tell with lists because lists have very flat prosodic structure, so in lists you almost get little intonational phrases. So you don't know what the phonological unit is, the prosodic unit is. But we thought this might give us a methodology for testing the fact that the idea that phonological words are constructed during phonological encoding. So way back then, we developed a version of the prepared speech task to test whether phonological words are constructed during language planning. Basically, if the phonological word is a planning unit, prepared speech onset latencies should be a function of the number of phonological words in the utterance, according to, if we're taking the correct information from Sternberg's tasks. Critically, we wanted to test sentences, so things with language structure, not lists, and use a more natural utterance generation task, in that we wanted our subjects to generate their own utterances internally. Okay, we didn't want to play them to them, we wanted them to do the generation. Okay. So this is the original Dutch experiment. We tested the prepared production. I'll show you the methodology in a bit, but it's better if I show you the examples first. We tested the production of these sentences in Dutch. So this is ik zoek het water, which is I seek the water, ik zoek vers water, I seek fresh water, and ik zoek water, I seek water. Okay? If you look at these two first, so the clitic and the non-clitic sentences, they've got a similar syntactic structure, same number of lexical items, but they differ in their prosodic structure. The determiner, the, which is spelled wrong in Dutch, de-stresses and therefore cliticizes to the verb to form a single phonological word, whereas the adjective fresh, thirst, is a heavier syllable. It doesn't de-stress, it attracts stress and maintains its own phonological word status. So these sentences have two phonological words and this one has three. And we compared it to control sentences, ik zoek water, which again have two phonological words but have no determiner, so they have one less lexical item. Okay? Now I'm asking you to take my word for it at the moment, but I will show you these things later. We're making a few assumptions in this part. We're assuming that phonological word structure is determined by prosodic information alone, rather than lexical or syntactic information. So by that I mean we're assuming that what causes this cliticization is the fact that it de-stresses, not the fact that it's a determiner and this is an adjective, so it's not a content word thing. And also syntax is not affected because we're assuming leftward cliticization, so we're breaking the syntactic structure because that determiner should actually stay within the noun phrase. And I'll come back to those assumptions later, but actually for the phonological word number, it doesn't matter at the moment. So if utterance onset latencies are a function of the number of phonological words, speech onset latencies, prepared speech onset latencies, will be significantly shorter in the clitic and the control conditions than in the non-clitic condition, and critically, there should be no difference between the clitic and the control conditions. If it's just a number of phonological words, they should behave the same way, even though one has a whole syllable less. Okay, so how did we get subjects to prepare these sentences? This was the timeline on the trial. It was a very simple prepared speech production task. We had in mind that later we might want to do an online version with minimal changes, which is why we designed it in this way. Warning signal, pause, noun phrase. So we're giving them the noun phrase. We're assuming that's going to be broken up in the phonological word structuring, but we're giving them the noun phrase. So they'll read either the water, fresh water, or water. Then they get a question through headphones. Wat zoek je? What do you seek? And their task is to prepare a response to the question given the noun phrase they've just been shown. So they generate their own internal sentence. And they're told, prepare to produce it as quickly as you can on the third beat. So they've generated a sentence, and then they have to prepare it to be as quick as they can on the third beat. First beat comes after 2 seconds, then the next one after 1, and the final beat, of course, has to be variable to stop people just anticipating and going when we think the beat's coming rather than waiting for the beat to arrive. And we measure speech onset latency from the offset of the final beat. Okay? So we've got quite a long time to prepare, to generate and prepare these sentences. It's quite a straightforward task. Okay, as I said, very simple graphs. What we found was what we predicted, which is probably why I'm telling you about it. So the non-clitics were significantly longer than the clitical controls, which didn't differ. So that was the basic minimum effect that we wanted. There are a couple of potential confounds with our phonological word hypothesis. The first is that the spoken duration of the non-clitic sentences is going to be longer. You know, if you've got a stressed syllable, it's going to take longer to produce. So even if you're just caring about prosodic factors, maybe you just breathe in a bit further when you've got more to say. So we looked at utterance durations. We measured the durations of our subject speech. We got a different pattern of results. So yes, there's a significant difference in spoken duration from the clitic to the non-clitic sentences, as of course you would expect. There's also a significant difference between the clitic and the control sentences. And that difference is not reflected in the latencies. And as we go through, you'll see that actually these latency patterns are unrelated to the whole sentence duration. The other issue is the content word issue. One sentence has got more content words than the other. And perhaps something about holding content words in your memory when you're preparing to produce an utterance is more costly. You could imagine ways in which that might be the case. So in follow-up experiments, we tested the production of sentences like this, where the determiner is phrase final and gets stress. So what do you seek? I seek it. I seek it. Which makes this a 2 phonological word utterance. If this attracts stress, it becomes a phonological word in its own right. And the latencies for these sentences, with this stressed and therefore gaining phonological word status, were statistically identical. In fact, they were only a few milliseconds out from exuket vata. So exuket and exuket vata have the same onset latencies. So therefore, we can't really explain these patterns in terms of numbers of content words either. So based on these findings, we argued that this was evidence that lexical items are restructured into phonological words prior to articulation, and that Sternberg's task is tapping into that process. You generate rhythmic units if you have to produce them. If you've got time to do it, you have to produce them quickly, and the number of those units is what determines how quickly you can get started. How you model that is a different issue, and that's something we could talk about maybe. So that was the first of Level's claims, that we generate phonological words. That's part of what phonological encoding does. His second claim was that the phonological word is the minimum unit of output. So that basically, all other things being equal, and I do mean that, I'm not suggesting this is our scope of processing for conceptual or grammatical encoding or lexical access, but when those things are equal, he's saying the scope of phonological encoding should be based on completing your first phonological word. So you wait till you constructed it before you start to speak, when you're speaking fluently. That's your preferred unit, minimum unit of output. And this idea, this claim, is of course based on the proposal that language production is an incremental process. So that we start to speak before we finish planning an utterance. And that while early chunks of an utterance are being articulated, you can be dealing with getting together what you need downstream so that you can get things out fluently. So, if in fluent speech, speakers prefer to construct a whole phonological word before they begin to articulate, then, as I said, all other things being equal, speech onset latencies should be a function not of the number of phonological words in an utterance, but the size of the first phonological word. If you're going just as quickly as you can, and you're speaking incrementally, it should now be the size of the first unit that determines speech onset latency. Yeah? We don't care, we're going incremental, we'll do the rest later. Now, if this is the case, then those assumptions I made earlier become important, because then the size of the initial unit in these sentences is dependent on where that clitic attaches. Okay? Now, within linguistic theory, there are arguments. I think that's only to be expected. Getting a consensus of linguists is about as hard as getting a consensus of psychologists. There are two major competing parsing algorithms for phonological words. The one I've been assuming, of course, is the one of Aditi Lahiri and her colleagues, because she's my favourite linguist. And I think it's important with the speed of development of linguistics that one chooses one's favourite linguist and tests their theories, because it's the only way to keep up. According to this parsing algorithm, all syntactic classes can be phonological words. It's a phonological thing. It's about prominence that determines whether something gets phonological word status or not. So only prosodic information is relevant. Phonological words comprise of stressed foot, to which unstressed syllables can be adjoined leftwards. And she has beautiful historical data showing this kind of end-adjoining habit in languages. So that's why we went with exucate and vector. Okay, this is the phonological parsing algorithm that she proposed. Her very good friend and scaly woman, Lisa Selkirk, has an alternative theory, and this is a syntactic parsing algorithm. So according to Selkirk's parsing algorithm, it's actually built on lexical syntactic information. So only content words can stand alone as phonological words. Function words must attach. So a phonological word comprises a content word plus any function words within a syntactic phrase. So this algorithm cares about grammatical class of words. It also cares about syntactic phrasal structure. So according to this parsing algorithm, all of our sentences have an initial phonological word of the same size, because critically, in the clitic cases, this is going to have to stay with its noun. Yeah? So, in an online production methodology, where what should matter is the size of the first chunk you have to get out, Selkirk's parsing algorithm says we should flatline, and the phonological one says the clitics should now take the longest to initiate, because you've got to get that determiner and you've got to criticize it. Yeah? Is that clear? So we did an online version of our task. So again, we changed it as little as possible. Warning signal, pause, noun phrase. And now we're really working against ourselves, yeah, with giving the noun phrases a chunk. Same questions, but now the task is simply to respond as quickly as you possibly can again producing a response based on the question we've been asked. And we measured onset latencies from the onset of the verb in the spoken question. We could have chosen any point, but that's kind of the onset of the information that you need to start your construction process. So the task is very similar in terms of the methodology. It's very different for the subject. Now they're holding on to a noun phrase, they're hearing a question, as soon as they know what to go with, they've got to go. And we push them to go fast again. We want this to be as incremental as we can get it with such short phrases. And what we found was a very different pattern of latency data. So now, it takes you longer to initiate exec vata than it does exec first vata, than it does exec vata. And these two don't differ. So we get the change, and this is compatible with the size of phonological words that were predicted by Aditi's and Carlos's phonological parsing algorithm. So evidence that this encliticizes to the verb. The duration, when we measured them, were identical to the previous experiments, so again showing no relationship between spoken duration and onset latencies. So evidence then that online latencies reflect the length of the initial phonological word rather than the number of chunks that you're producing, and that in Dutch, clitics attach leftwards. Okay, so as I said, the last 5 minutes is on the English stuff. The reason for this is that we can't quite explain what we found. So let me show you what we... This is also why it's quite nice for a workshop, so I'm hoping you can help. We wanted first to replicate the Dutch findings in English, and then look at more detailed effects on articulation. So looking at articulatory evidence for resonification, changes in phoneme stop aspiration, etc. And also then to go on to look at aspects to do with the interface between syntax and prosody, where you're getting a mismatch. You don't always, but where you do, what were the effects there on planning? So we basically started with a straight replication. These are the same kinds of sentences. I built the boats, I built 3 boats, I built the boats. Same number of stimuli, same variation in verbs, same methodology for the prepared paradigm, and we completely flatlined. So we got nothing. But we got, of course, again, beautiful and reliable duration differences, which is not particularly surprising. And we flatlined across all of the clitic types. We looked at this every which way. So none of them showed anything. This kind of looks like it's going the right way, but it's not there at all. So then you think, what have I done wrong? Because there's no reason phonologically for Dutch to behave differently from English. The evidence in terms of encliticization is just as strong for English and Dutch. They're much more similar than, for example, Dutch and German or English and German. So I tried it again. I tried it another 2 times, worrying that perhaps the experimenter hadn't pushed people to prepare enough, that we might be getting a mishmash of prepared and delayed because the subjects weren't on the ball. It stays not there. It stays not there. So then we started listening in detail to our recordings of our subjects to see if there was any clue at all in what might be going on. And the only thing we could think of was the nature of the pronoun. So we're assuming in all of these experiments that an unstressed pronoun at the start of a sentence procliticizes. So you get this, ik drink it, I drink it, yeah? So that just makes one unit. The only real difference is that I, unlike ik, has a big, fat, long vowel, and we thought, well, maybe there's some difference in the degree to which this is attracting stress. So sometimes it might be procliticizing, sometimes it wouldn't. Maybe that's just smearing out our effect. So Aditi is a linguist, so she started looking at speech measurements for this. We're still in the process of that. It's a heinous process, and we're getting no real relationships between the size of this initial pronoun and any of the other data pattern that we can find. I'm an experimentalist, so I thought we'd just do it again without the pronoun. So we did exactly the same experiment, but now we didn't have to produce the pronoun. So it would be, what do you drink? What did you drink? Or what do you drink? Drink the wine. Slightly odd. English is not pro-doc, but in a delayed task at least, it's fine. People could do this fine. So again, we just said don't say the pronoun. They got into it quite quickly. It wasn't a problem, and the effect appears when you drop the pronoun. So again, speech onset latency in the non-clitic condition is significantly longer than both the clitic and control conditions, which do not differ. And again, it's very reliable across the different clitic types. It's a nice, believable effect. So then, we were assuming, again, because we have a phonological parsing algorithm, that the critical difference is in the phonological nature of the pronouns. Maybe there's just something special about sentence initial pronouns in English that we're unaware of, that we should then go and investigate further. So we tried the English again, but using he instead of I. And he, again, it's a shorter vowel, it de-stresses and procliticizes more easily. He built the boat. He built the boat. He built the boat. It's more like it in terms of its basic phonological characteristics. So if it's something to do with the phonology, it should work with he. If it's something to do with pronouns, it shouldn't. And it works really nicely. So again, we're getting that same pattern where the number of phonological words is now, again, determining speech onset latency. So from this, so we don't know what's going on here. So the only thing we can take from this is whatever the critical factor is, it's phonological, not syntactic. But we still have no idea why I is problematic. Okay, so the very last experiment, very quickly, is the online version of this. Okay, so again, the problem with the parsing algorithms is also true of English. So where does that clitic go? Does it go to the first phonological word? Does it stick within syntactic boundaries? And what we get with the English, again, it's not quite as beautiful, but we do get now that the clitics in the online paradigm take longer to produce than the non-clitics, and there are no other significant differences. So while these two don't differ, which is what we want, those two also don't differ. So it's still not quite as pretty a picture, and we need to look into that more. But critically, again with the English, we show this effect, where it's the size of the first phonological word that's critical between the clitics and the non-clitics in the online production, and it's the number of phonological words that's critical in the delayed production. And again, this is data in support of the phonological word as a minimum unit of output, and for leftward cliticization in English for output. Okay, I'm going to summarise and conclude quickly. So our results for English sentences, sentence production, replicate the main findings of the Dutch results of Wheeldon and Lahiri. Latencies in both the delayed and online tasks are a function of phonological word structure, so number of phonological words when you've prepared the whole utterance, first phonological word when you haven't. And this effect is, especially the delayed production paradigm, is now being used by linguists in a whole range of different languages as a kind of diagnostic tool for phonological grouping and output. And similar effects now have been shown in Spanish and Italian, and there was a lovely poster using it on first and second language production speakers, English Bengali. So this is kind of being taken up as a diagnostic. It's a very simple, easy tool, and you can get some very nice, reliable results from it as long as you don't say I. Theoretically, the whole series of experiments provide, I think, good support for Leibel's proposal that the phonological word is a preferred output unit during speech planning, because in the online task, participants clearly prefer to construct such units even at the cost of initiation speed. They don't need to. They don't need to take longer. They do take longer. So there must be something preferable in building that rhythmic unit when you're having to produce fluent utterances. Results also support the theory that clitics attach leftward in English as in Dutch. And the different pattern observed with the I and the he pronouns really have to be due to something about their phonological characteristics and can't be explained by syntactic class, because then why does he work and I doesn't? And this provides further support for a parsing algorithm based on phonological rather than syntactic information. So I hope I've kind of convinced you that you can use very simple reaction time methodologies to test both processing and aspects of processing theory and aspects of linguistic theory in terms of, you know, how units are formed within different languages. And I like reaction times, so I'll leave it there.
We've still got 6 minutes for questions.
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure whether I was paying attention earlier, but yeah, the effect size was quite different in different experiments. Like the Dutch original experiment, 10 to 15 milliseconds or something like that, and sometimes it goes up to 50 milliseconds. So, do we get some? How do you interpret?
There are issues with the effect size. It is an issue we don't know. So actually, in the delayed production, it's much more reliable. So it tends to vary between 20 to 40.
Right.
No, I have no explanation. And you get variations, as with all of these things, in subject speed. And I haven't looked to see if it relates to that, but I wouldn't be surprised. When they're doing it well, you get better effects than when they're not. And this is, of course, one of the downsides of these tasks, where you're making predictions based on some expectation of degree of preparedness.
Right.
Because, of course, people can, I mean, we're pushing so that they're doing the thing we want them to, but of course they're not always doing the thing we want them to. So, yeah, you get all of those effects in there.
So the slope is not very theoretically informative, you think?
No, I mean, so the Sternberg stuff, you got beautifully reliable results. They had 6 subjects. They did this hundreds of times. So yes, you could push it, but I'm not sure that's then again, as you're saying, the process that I want to be investigating. So their model was that what you got is a series of motor programs, and the reason that you get this linear effect is that the time it takes you to find the first one you need is a function of how many you've got stored. That doesn't work for sentence production, because these things are not stored in a random order, or these things. There's structure here that gives you linear order. So the explanation for the effect would have to be something more to do with, if you've got several of these, it takes you longer to activate the first one you need. It can't be a search process, because that makes no sense if you're storing sentences. But yes, no, it's more variable without a doubt. But we were kind of in the first few thrilled to get it at all.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah, they didn't tend to. The only instruction we gave them was final sentence, final phrase stress, which is kind of what they did anyway. It's standard declarative. We were slightly worried that they might decide to stress the verb, but actually they didn't. And on the whole, I mean, this was the frustrating thing with listening to hours of very, very boring sentences. to try to again, to work out where we should look next. Yeah, you just kind of look at your data and you think, well, what might be the issue? It all sounded just fine. It all sounded just fine, so we were really quite confused. But you know, with the pronoun thing, it's there, flat line, 3 times flat line. Take it off, it's back. I am perplexed. And until we find a story, we can't publish it. So we have to find just help me. It's tricky.
Yes, helping you find a story. I don't know that I can do that. But I'm intrigued because listening to your presentation, before you told us what you were trying, I said to myself, did she try he instead of I? And you did, which is great. So why was I thinking about that? I'm wondering about sonority contours at the onset of the word. The English examples you gave were the onset consonants for the verbs always twice.
We had a whole variety of verbs, and each verb was its own control across the conditions. So, so that couldn't be the issue. So they always started with I in the verb in all conditions.
And the first verb was built, which is voiced. I can't remember the other two.
Well, no, there were 18 verbs across all conditions, so we varied it a lot.
I'll have to think some more.
Please.
All right. Let's thank Dr. Wheeldon again for giving such a very